What's going on, everybody? We got another UFC card to break down for this weekend. The main event, it is Virna Jandiroba taking on Amanda Lemos. As you're watching this video, do me a favor, like it and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you have not already. We'll also be doing a giveaway in this video, as well as a winner to announce from last week, where what we did last week was which fighter on the card will score the most fantasy points. And it ended up being Montel Jackson, who, just destroyed Damon Blackshear. Is like 15 seconds into the fight. First punch that lands of the entire fight knocks Blackshear out cold. So quick win bonus for Montel Jackson. That I'm scoring a little bit more fantasy points than Rosnam Yunus. The winner was Daddy242024. That is a very online username. So Daddy242024, you are the winner of the free Odd Shopper subscription. DM me on Twitter and I'll get you set up with that. For this week, we're going to do who do you guys think wins the main event and how many fantasy points do they score? Whoever is closest to the right answer, you'll win yourself a free Odd Shopper subscription. But let's start breaking down the fights here. And I've got my lineups all built out. One thing that did cause me to start recording this video, then have to restart, is we had a fight canceled. It was what was supposed to be the co-main event between Park and Tavares. That fight has been called off. So unless there is some super late notice opponent that's added for Brad Tavares, we're down to just 11 fights. So as a consequence, a couple things I recommend is I'll leave salary on the table with a bunch of your lineups. I think that's a good way to differentiate. And don't be afraid to take some chances, because this is only going to be an 11-fight card now. There is going to be a lot of overlap, a lot of lineups that are duped as well. So just try to get different where you can. And then also, there's only one fighter on the entire card that's a north of -200 favorite. That is Miranda Maverick. So there's going to be a ton of low-priced fighters that end up winning. So all the more reason to build some lineups, leave salary on the table, because I would not at all be surprised to see the winning lineup leave something like $1,000 or even more in salary on the table. But let's start with the main event. And like I said, there's only 11 fights and it's kind of split. About half of them are going to be, I think, great banger sort of fights. And then a lot of them potential to be pretty boring. And that is kind of the main event as well, because I see this as being a very dominant win for somebody. If Virna Jandiroba is able to land takedowns, I think she dominates a lot of the action. If she isn't, Amanda Lemos is such a better striker than Jandiroba that it's not going to be remotely competitive on the feet. But now the reason I do think that we're going to see Virna land takedowns in this spot, she does land 2.36 takedowns per 15 minutes. She's a pretty smart fighter. She knows her path to victory. She doesn't get into any of these fights where she's like, hey, I'm just going to stand and trade and see what happens, which we do see oftentimes wrestlers and grapplers end up falling on. Not Virna Jandiroba. And then Amanda Lemos on the other side only defends takedowns at a 57% clip. So we've seen her in a bunch of her fights get taken down, not just once, but often multiple times. Mackenzie Dern got her down once. Zhang Weili took her down 6 times. Michelle Waterson-Gomez, who just retired, she was able to take down Amanda Lemos as well. The times you don't see Lemos taken down is like in a fight against Marina Rodriguez, who is a fighter that never, ever shoots takedowns. So I do think Jandiroba is going to be able to land takedowns in this spot. And if she does, I think she could wear down on the gas tank of Amanda Lemos, be the fresher fighter down the stretch, potentially even submit Lemos, because that is something we've seen happen to her in the past as well. And Jandiroba is a very good submission grappler. So as things currently stand, this is a fight in the mid-range. Jandiroba we have projected to have a lot of ownership, but I think it is warranted. I have her in about half of my lineups right now, not necessarily writing off Amanda Lemos, but I'm even with the field on Lemos, who's projected for 37% ownership, and slightly overweight to the field on Jandiroba. Whoever does win this fight, I do think should score well. If Lemos wins, it's probably a knockout. If Jandiroba wins, I do think it's going to be wrestling, grappling oriented, and she probably scores north of 100 fantasy points in that path to victory. Going to what I assume is going to be the new co-main event. So, like I said, it was supposed to be the Brad Tavares fight, which ended up getting scratched. And this is what it's listed on the UFC website. So, who knows? Maybe the bout order ends up changing. But this is one of the fights that I think should be a banger. And most of the fights on the main card, I think, are going to be awesome. It should be a really, really fun main card to watch, even if it isn't the most name value fighters. It are a lot of fighters that fight at a really high pace and a lot of potential for finishes. Like you look at the recent fights for Steve Garcia, look at the last handful of them. KO's Mel Costa in his last fight. Before that, KO's Shailin Durden-Becky. Before that, KO's Chase Hooper. So we've got a 3-fight win streak here for Steve Garcia, all with knockouts. And also he got knocked down himself in the Durden-Becky fight. Then you look at the fights before then, He gets knocked out by Mahashate and also got knocked down twice in about a minute in that fight before getting finished. And then he ends up finishing Charlie Ontiveros in the second round of that fight. Ontiveros is terrible, and he was able to knock down Steve Garcia twice in the first round of that fight. So Steve Garcia fights at a high pace, has a lot of power, knocks guys out, questionable durability. Sungwoo Choi on the other side, you could say a lot of the same things against him. In his last fight against Jarno Aarons, he comes away with a win, but also got knocked down in that fight, while also landing a knockdown of his own. In a fight against Michael Trezano, and Trezano, by the way, has zero power at all in his hands, and he knocks Sungwoo Choi down twice, and that fight ends up finishing in the first round, and Sungwoo Choi also landed a knockdown of his own. He gets knocked down twice by Josh Holobaugh. He gets submitted by Alex Caceres, but also landed a knockdown of his own in that fight. So when you look at the careers of these two fighters, Sungwoo Choi and Steve Garcia, they both get finished a lot. They also both finish their opponents a lot, and each of them end up getting knocked down a ton, win or loss in their fights. So I think the winner of this fight is going to put up a massive DraftKings score. I also think it's going to be a fight where it could go either way. It's close to a coin flip. The one thing that I think we could feel pretty confident, though, it's going to be a war and somebody should get finished. I'm leaning more so on the Steve Garcia side. He's $8,600. I do trust his durability a little bit more than Sungwoo Choi because we have seen Steve Garcia get hurt, knocked down, and come back to win. And you get really concerned when Sungwoo Choi gets knocked down twice against a fighter like Michael Trezano. So I'm going to be higher on Steve Garcia. Currently have him in 45% of my lineups. And then as far as Sungwoo Choi, he is currently in, I'm in 24% of lineups right now. I might do a little bit of an ROI boost to get a little bit higher. And ideally, I would like to be overweight to both sides of what I think is going to be the new co-main event for this card. Should be a great fight. Next fight that we have to look at here, it is Kurt Holobaugh against Kanen Kruschewsky. And this is another fight that I do think should be fought at a pretty high pace. Kurt Holobaugh is old. Not only is he actually old, he also looks very old because he's got the white strip in the front of his hair. He's got a lot of gray. And then also he's somebody with a lot of experience, which comes with being older. So Kurt Holobaugh, this is what, his third stint in the UFC, something along those lines. And he has had very minimal success at his older age now, fighting back in the UFC. He got back into the UFC after winning on The Ultimate Fighter against Austin Hubbard. But you look at him overall throughout his career, he's now fought 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times in the UFC, and he has one career win. So with that being the case, we do have Kruschewsky coming out as a slight betting favorite for this matchup. It is, I think he's like a minus 135 at the time I'm recording. Here's the issue, though, that I have with Kruschewsky in this matchup. It should be close to a coin flip. You know, that's the way the betting odds have it as well. Slightly lean towards Kruschewsky, which I think is totally reasonable considering the advanced age of Kurt Holobaugh. But do you really want to roster somebody to $8,700 in a coin flip sort of fight? That's where I kind of get hung up here on Kruschewsky and why I'm a little bit higher on the Kurt Holobaugh side. He's only $7,500 in a fight that's close to a pick'em, and that's going to be the case with a lot of these fights where when you only have one fight on the entire card where fighters north of a minus 200 favorite, in the way that DraftKings lines the fighter prices based on the betting odds, you have a lot of fighters who are like 87, 8,800, 9,000, things along those lines, and they're only pick'ems to end up winning. So with that being the case, I'm higher on the Kurt Holobaugh side. This is another fight where I think the winner should score reasonably well, not quite as confident as something like the co-main event, but both these fighters, they're capable of wrestling. They're capable of grappling. They also both strike at a pretty high rate. So I think this is a fight where somebody should end up scoring reasonably well. And with that being the case, it's another fight I want to target. I'm going to be a little bit higher on the Holobaugh side because at $7,500, I think that he's very likely to be in the optimal lineup in a win. Whereas on the Kruschewsky side, if he wins, he could be in the optimal lineup, but might not be because of his price tag. If we look at the next fight here, it is another banger sort of fight. Cody Durden against Bruno Silva. And I like Cody Durden quite a bit as a fighter. I'm picking him to win this as well. He has the better gas tank than Bruno Silva. He's also going to be the minute winner in this matchup. But on the Bruno Silva side, better finisher. So if Silva wins, it's probably going to come either by knockout, potentially by submission. Durden is going to be looking to shoot takedowns. If this fight does go to the judges' scorecards, I'm very confident Durden wins. And also, he generally scores well in any of his wins because he lands nearly 5 takedowns per 15 minutes. On the feet, he's also somewhat active considering how many takedowns he lands, landing over 3 significant strikes per minute. But keep in mind, not a lot of his fights are taking place on the feet all that often. So his striking output's a little bit higher than what it appears to be on paper. And then you have a fighter on the other side here in Bruno Silva, who doesn't have the best takedown defense at 64%. He is the more potent finisher of the two, which is a concern because Durden finished multiple times. His last fight against Tagir Ulanbekov, he got taken down 5 times. He got knocked down. He ends up getting finished. Before then, we did see Durden go on a 4-fight win streak. Fight before that, though, club and sub against Muhammad Mokaev. No shame in that loss whatsoever. Also got submitted by Jimmy Flick. That was a pretty bad loss because Jimmy Flick, his career has really not aged well at all. But Cody Durden does get hurt on the feet a lot. Even though we haven't seen him get knocked out in the UFC, it's because there's been situations like the Tagir Ulanbekov fight or the Muhammad Mokaev fight where he did get hurt on the feet. He got knocked down and ended up getting submitted. And that is a path to victory for Bruno Silva. So I really think this is a great fight to target. I'm going to be higher on the Durden side because, number one, I'm picking him to win. But then another part of this as well is there's been a lot of betting line movement over the course of the week where Cody Durden is $8,300 and they've got Bruno Silva at $7,900. So as a result of that, we now have Bruno Silva as the slight betting favorite. As we get closer to lock tomorrow, I think we're going to see Bruno Silva get to be really popular. I think Silva could end up being like 35% owned or something like that. And if that is the case, I think Durden makes for a really good leverage play. We see these situations all the time in the mid-range where just because a fighter is a slight betting favorite, they end up being the much more popular of the two fighters. Even though the fight based on the betting odds would be like 55-45 to win, you could still see the fighter who's the betting favorite end up with double the ownership of the other fighter. It's not going to get to be quite that excessive because there's now only 11 fights on the card, but I do think this ownership comes down a little bit on Durden and then it comes up a little bit on Bruno Silva. I do think I'm going to end up being overweight to both sides of the fight, but leaning towards Cody Durden, really like him as a mid-range play and hoping that it's a spot as well where I could get a little bit of leverage. Looking at the next fight here, Doo Ho Choi against Bill Algeo. And once again, another banger. This should be a great fight. If you guys aren't familiar with Doo Ho Choi, he used to be a really, really fan favorite fighter, but then his career kind of got off track. A lot of long layoffs. We haven't seen him fight all that much recently. Last time he fought, it was about a year and a half ago and had what was a really controversial loss to Kyle, or it was a draw against Kyle Nelson. I thought Doo Ho Choi pretty clearly won the fight, but Kyle Nelson made it super boring, which I didn't even know was possible to make a Doo Ho Choi fight boring. Because if you look at the previous fights that Doo Ho Choi had in the UFC, fight of the night against Charles Jourdain, he did get knocked out, but it was a great fight while it lasted. They each knocked each other down. Against Jeremy Stephens, this fight was a main event. It was another one. Fight of the night, Jeremy Stephens knocks out Doo Ho Choi in the second round. Against Cub Swanson, another one. Fight of the night. Cub Swanson ends up winning a decision against Thiago Tavares. This is a fight that Doo Ho Choi got a finish, got a performance bonus. Also against Sam Sicilia, another fight, a finish, and a performance bonus for Doo Ho Choi. And then his UFC debut, he gets a knockout win in 18 seconds. So he's all these incredible fights and performances throughout his entire career. Then he fights Kyle Nelson, and the fight just totally sucks. Funny enough, Bill Algeo, he looked like he was somebody who was on the come up going into his last fight against Kyle Nelson, was a really big favorite, and he gets knocked out by Kyle Nelson. It was a very controversial stoppage. So you have Kyle Nelson coming off, or I should say Bill Algeo coming off a controversial stoppage loss to Kyle Nelson, and then Doo Ho Choi coming off a controversial draw against Kyle Nelson. And Kyle Nelson's not particularly good. So I do have concerns that Doo Ho Choi and Bill Algeo, that both of them have had their better days in the past behind them. But with that said, just considering the fight style of these two, this should be a war. We've got Bill Algeo landing north of 6 significant strikes per minute. Doo Ho Choi lands close to 5. Neither of them have good takedown defense, but I don't think it's really going to come into play all that much in this fight because neither of them look to shoot takedowns all that often. I'm going to lean towards Bill Algeo just because he has been the more active of the two fighters. We've already seen him fight in 2024. He fought twice in 2023. Whereas on the Doo Ho Choi side, we have now seen him fight once since 2019, and he's not won a fight since the Tavares win back in 2016. So concerned about the damage that we've seen on Doo Ho Choi. Not that I'm not concerned about on the Bill Algeo side, but it's more so the damage on Doo Ho Choi combined with the inactivity. So I'm going to pick Bill Algeo to win, but another really good fight to target. I've got Bill Algeo right now in 42% of my lineups. He is expected to be popular, projected for 37% ownership. And then Choi, I'm also getting to him a little bit overweight to the field because I do think he's getting slept on. He's projected for sub 20% ownership. So I'm overweight to both sides of the fight. If you're looking for a low-owned punt play, you could do worse than Choi. But I also think Bill Algeo, he's a warranted chalk piece for the slate. Moving on, and we have another banger of a fight. And this one is going to be Jung-Hung Lee taking on Haider Amil. And I think Amil is another really good-looking punt contrarian option because we do not have the field getting to Haider Amil really at all. He's projected for 15% ownership. And considering that we now have 11 fights on the card, it looks like he's going to be one of the lowest-owned fighters. And he's somebody who keeps a very high pace in his fights, landing nearly 5 significant strikes per minute, and another really fan-friendly fight style. In the 2 fights we've seen him so far, one of them was on the Contender Series, and the Contender Series fight, honestly, that one did kind of suck because he got taken down 5 times. That is an issue we've seen Haider Amil run into. But then he had the fight against Fernie Garcia where he just put on hellacious pace, gets a knockdown, lands 79 significant strikes, and a takedown in a fight that ended up ending in the second round. And on the Jung-Hung Lee side, from what we've seen out of him, I don't know that he's going to be able to keep up with the pace of Haider Amil just because we've never seen that before in his career history. He had 2 finishes on the road to UFC, and then we look at his UFC fights after getting into the UFC off of the road to the UFC. He had the fight against Blake Bilder. That fight was terrible. He lands 49 significant strikes in a fight that goes to a 3-round decision. And then he had a split decision in his road to the UFC finale fight against Yiza, and he only landed 25 significant strikes in that. So I do think that Jung-Hung Lee is probably the more polished striker of the two, and maybe Haider Amil is just so aggressive that he just ends up running into a strike and maybe gets hurt that way. But if this fight does go to the judges' scorecards, considering the kind of pace and pressure we've seen Amil be able to put up, I just think he ends up winning a decision and could score reasonably well in that kind of fight. So I think the field is sleeping at him when he's only going to be projected for 15% ownership. So I like him as a contrarian piece. Also going to be getting to some exposure to Jung-Hung Lee, but I'm a little bit underweight to the field, I should say, because he is projected to be quite chalky. So Haider Amil, I think that's a good contrarian piece to differentiate some lineups on a smaller fight card that is not a full card because of the fight that got canceled. Brian Kelleher against Cody Gibson. And, this is a weird fight because Brian Kelleher, I would have very confidently picked to win this fight just a couple of years ago, but he's older now. Not to say that Cody Gibson is young. He's only a year younger than Brian Kelleher, but it's more so the mileage on Brian Kelleher. Cody Gibson, part-time fighter, also part-time teacher as well. Actually, I guess teacher is his full-time occupation. So we've got Brian Kelleher as a fighter who's been around for forever. His UFC debut came all the way back in 2017. He's been super active despite getting finished a bunch of time, finishing opponents. He's had back issues. He had back surgery and all that long ago. So we saw him with a little bit of a layoff because of the back surgery. Comes back to fight Cody Garbrandt. And yeah, on a skill level, he was at a disadvantage against Cody Garbrandt, but he also just looked really slow. And the first thing he landed clean against him, it knocked him out in the first round. Fights before that, he got submitted against Mario Bautista. He got submitted by Umar Nurmagomedov. And there's no shame in any of these 3 losses, but just physically, Brian Kelleher didn't look the same to me anymore. And we've seen him finish so many times over the course of his career now that I just don't know that we could expect him to still take any kind of punishment. And that's kind of important to the way that Brian Kelleher gets into a lot of wars and a lot of fights where they go back and forth. There's a lot of big strikes exchange. There's a lot of wrestling and grappling exchanges. So if we do get a durable version of Brian Kelleher, he's live to pull off an upset. Cody Gibson is about a minus 195 favorite. He's the second biggest favorite on the card behind Miranda Maverick. But just because I have so many questions about Brian Kelleher's durability, and we've seen Cody Gibson have some fights that have been fought at crazy high paces, like his fight on The Ultimate Fighter, the finale against Brad Katona, even though Cody Gibson lost, he got a UFC contract because the fight was awesome. He lands 164 significant strikes. Brad Katona lands 160. So I feel much better about the durability of Cody Gibson than I do about Brian Kelleher. And if the fight goes 15 minutes, I think we're much more likely to see a finish on the Cody Gibson side. A little bit of a scary price tag on him at $9,300, but because of the way that we've seen him be able to put up a lot of strikes like in that fight on the Ultimate Fighter. I do like him as a pay up option. He's the expensive fighter I get the most exposure to. He's also not expected to be all that popular, sub 30% ownership. So I'm overweight to the field on Cody Gibson. He is currently my most rostered pay up option for the entire slate. Moving on here, we've got a couple of lesser fights coming up. Talked before about all the fights that I thought were bangers, and now to open the card, we've got a bunch of what are honestly probably going to be fairly shitty fights. And also, if you guys need help building your lineups, we do have our Sims tool at Stochastic. You can sign up using the link we have below. It's what I use to build all my lineups for every DFS sport that I play now. And it comes in really handy for a fight card like this that only has 11 fights, because it's going to help you weed out some of the lineups that are expected to be heavily duped, because we do have that as part of the contest generator. You build the lineup, it identifies all your lineups, it identifies which ones are expected to be duped the most heavily. And then when you simulate the slate out, it will take some of those lineups that are expected to be really heavily duped and weed them out of your pool portfolio there. But if we go through here, and if you want to sign up, links are all below in the YouTube description box. Mentioned before, Miranda Maverick, biggest favorite on the card. We've got Deani Barbosa taking this fight on about a week's notice. This was supposed to be Tracy Cortez against Miranda Maverick, but when we saw that last week's main event fell out between Rose Namajunas and Macy Barber, what ended up happening was Tracy Cortez stepped in. Miranda Maverick didn't have an opponent. This fight card was already light on fights, so Barbosa steps up on short notice. As a result, Maverick's a big favorite. She should have a path to victory here as well. Barbosa does not have the best cardio. She also fights at a very slow pace. So those are advantages that I think Maverick should have in her back pocket. If the fight goes 3 rounds, I don't know how well Barbosa is going to hold up over 3 rounds, especially considering the late notice. And then I do think Maverick's the minute winner here as well. So Barbosa's path to victory is probably going to have to be a finish. And I just don't think that's all that likely to materialize against Miranda Maverick. So I'm pretty confidently picking her to win. But the problem is she's $9,200. I'm going to be underweight to the field on her, projected for 25% ownership. Only ever in 16% of my top lineups right now, and no real interest in Barbosa for me as a punt option. So like we said, some stinker fights coming up. This should be one of them. Not a fight I'm all that interested in. Next fight here. This one is probably going to be shitty, but it's also a weird one from a standpoint of Radzhabov fights extremely aggressively, and most of his fights are really fun to watch. And Trey Ogden does next to nothing in a lot of his fights, and almost all of them are shit to watch. So we'll see what ends up happening. Is Ogden able to slow the pace down and keep the fight at his tempo? Then I think the fight isn't going to be all that great. But if Loic Radzhabov is able to come up and really force the action out of Trey Ogden, we could end up having a sneaky fun fight on our hands. You look at Radzhabov, he's coming off a fight against Abdul Karim Al-Sawadi, which went back and forth. We saw Radzhabov land a knockdown, also had 4 takedowns. Al-Sawadi on the other side landed 3 takedowns of his own. And then we also saw a really fun fight for Radzhabov against Matusz Ronbetsky. And then as far as Trey Ogden goes, one thing he has added to his game that has made him more viable for DFS fights lately is that he's starting to shoot takedowns. Against Nicholas Mota, he landed 3 takedowns. This fight was ruled a no contest, but it was total BS. Trey Ogden won the fight handily. He should have had a finish at the end of the 3rd round as well, but because the ref came in and stopped it a little bit early, it got overturned to a no contest. So that was a little bit ridiculous. We should consider that a win for the purposes of breaking this fight down for Trey Ogden. And then last fight against Kurt Holobaugh, he also landed 3 takedowns. And like we've seen from Radzhabov, with only 55% takedown defense and getting taken down in his last couple of fights by Matusz Ronbetsky, and then as well as 3 times by Abdul Karim Al-Sawadi, he could be taken down. That's a path to victory for Trey Ogden. And I do think that is going to be the path that Trey Ogden tries to take to slow down Loic Radzhabov. And that's why I do think this fight could end up being a little bit underwhelming relative to other Radzhabov fights. I'm going to be higher on the Ogden side. He's expected to be pretty popular. I'm not all that much different from the field. Project for 34% ownership. I have him in 37% of lineups. So in a fight that is lined very closely, give me Trey Ogden, who is the cheaper fighter of the two at $7,800. Couple of fights left here to break down. This is going to be my least favorite fight on the entire card. Lucy Pudilova against Luana Carolina. Carolina was the last fighter to weigh in today. It did look like she might have had a little bit of a difficult weight cut. In the past, we've seen a lot of Carolina fights that have been pretty binary. If she stuffs takedowns, she ends up winning on the feet. If she doesn't, she gets dominated on the mat. as we've seen her advance in her UFC career, her takedown defense has gotten a little bit more sturdy, and that's been a path for her to end up winning fights, is keeping the fight standing. So like against Julia Stoliarenko in her last fight, that's a fight a few years ago. I think Stoliarenko probably takes her down in the first round and ends up armbarring her. But in this fight, she was able to outlast Stoliarenko. She defended the takedowns early, actually ended up landing some takedowns of her own throughout the fight, and then ends up finishing Stoliarenko in the later stages of the fight. But I don't know. I think this fight is very tough to call. It's a dead pick 'em at sports books right now. And I don't think the winner's going to score all that well, because even if Pudilova lands takedowns, I think she probably just sits in guard and doesn't really do all that much. Neither of these fighters attempt very many takedowns at all. Pudilova only 0.55 landed per 15 minutes for her career. So even though Carolina could be dominated on the mat in the past, it seems like it's an area that she's improving on. And then on the feet, neither of them really do a whole ton. And there are other fights we've talked about in the mid-range that are better to target. So this is not a fight I have all that much interest in. I'm hoping that it's going to be a pretty boring one. And I have 10% exposure to Pudilova right now and 7% on Carolina on the other side. And then we've got the opening fight for the card, and this should be another pretty crappy one because it is a low-level heavyweight fight, which almost always suck. And in this one is going to be Muhammad Usman, the brother of Kamaru Usman, taking on Thomas Peterson. And the reason I'm going to pick Peterson to win is just because he's busier. He lands nearly 4 significant strikes per minute. He's also capable of landing takedowns. Muhammad Usman, he's a pretty good athlete. I also think he's been making improvements as he's gone on in the UFC. He just doesn't do very much. So a lot of his fights are just really, really boring and not fan-friendly fights at all. He thought he got robbed in his last fight against Mick Parkin, but what can you expect when you only land 57 significant strikes? And then his other fights against Jake Collier, he wins, but only lands 85 significant strikes. And then in his fight against Junior Tafa, he wins a decision, but he only lands 7 significant strikes, just landed 2 takedowns and just stayed in top position to land a couple of those rounds. So I don't think this fight is going to be all that good. If it goes to a decision, I think it's going to score really poorly for DraftKings purposes. If Usman wins, if Peterson wins, he could be okay. If he's able to land a takedown or two, he should be a little bit busier on the feet. I think there's a little bit more finishing equity in Muhammad Usman, but I just don't think it's all that likely of a scenario. So I'm going to pick Peterson to win as the underdog, and at $7,400, I think that he's a viable DFS option, but still not a fight that I'm crazy about playing. So that's going to do it for us. That's a breakdown of the entire slate. If you haven't done yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Let me know in the comments section. In the main event, Amanda Lemos versus Virna Jandiroba, who wins and how many fantasy points do they score? Whoever gets the winner right and is closest to the correct fantasy point score, you win a free subscription to OddsShopper. That's our betting site. So good luck this weekend, guys. Hopefully we get no bizarre situations like last week we had the fight between Abdulrazak El Hassan and Cody Brundage, which totally ruined me. I had that fight in about 90% of my lineups. Didn't have the best looking lineups, but that was okay. I had some live ones and then just got totally destroyed by that particular fight being in 90% of my lineups. When you had Cody Brundage, took a couple legal shots to the head and then quit. Fight gets ruled a no contest. So hopefully none of that this weekend. No bizarre decisions. We get a fun fight card to watch here. Not the highest level, but should be some fun fights. So hopefully you all enjoy it. Good luck. I'll see you back here next week.